By 3:30, Eleanor Hartwell's body had been carried from the Rowan Orchard to the village hall, where it lay awaiting the arrival of the police from the county town. The autumn harvest fair had dissolved into something altogether different. Not quite chaos, but that peculiar state of enforced normalcy that villages adopt when confronted with genuine tragedy. Storekeepers remained at their posts, though few customers lingered. The band that had been scheduled to play at 4 o'clock was quietly cancelled. Life in Thornfield had not stopped precisely, but it had most certainly paused to take notice. Miss Marple had returned to the hall with Sergeant Hartley, moving at her habitual unhurried pace while everyone else seemed caught in various states of hurried confusion. She carried her shopping, the jar of Mrs. Henderson's jam, a small parcel of seed packets, as though she had not just witnessed the commencement of a murder investigation. This very ordinariness seemed to steady those around her. People spoke in her presence as they might speak to an elderly relative. There was something inherently calming about Miss Marple's assumption that the world, despite its occasional horrors, would continue turning much as it always had. Eleanor Hartwell had been 23 years old. She was the only daughter of David Hartwell, the village schoolteacher, and his wife Catherine, a woman known for her nervous disposition and her exceptional knowledge of parish records. Eleanor had been teaching the younger children at the village school for nearly 2 years, a position she had pursued despite considerable family expectation that she might do something more ambitious. She had been, by most accounts, competent though not remarkable, well liked by her pupils, respectable in her conduct, and increasingly distracted by her attachment to Simon Ashworth. This last detail emerged not through official questioning, but through the natural process of village gossip, which operated with the efficiency of a newspaper press and considerably more accuracy. By 4 o'clock, virtually everyone in Thornfield knew that Eleanor had been seen walking with Simon Ashworth on multiple occasions over the summer. By 4:30, it was common knowledge that they had met in secret, and that the Ashworth family, particularly Margaret's mother, who had social ambitions of the sort that did not align with dalliances with the schoolteacher's daughter, had put an end to the relationship approximately 6 weeks prior. By 5 o'clock, the narrative had crystallized into something approaching consensus. Eleanor, heartbroken and desperate, had perhaps taken her own life, and Margaret's discovery of her body was merely tragic coincidence. Miss Marple listened to these theories with her characteristic patience, sitting in a corner of the village hall where the constable had asked everyone to remain until the county police arrived. She said very little, which suited everyone perfectly. People who knew Miss Marple well understood that her silence was not empty, it was observational. Those who did not know her well simply preferred to talk to each other. "Poor girl," Mrs. Phillips murmured, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple with a cup of tea. "Though I must say, one cannot entirely blame the family. A girl cannot simply throw herself at a young man and expect no consequences. The Ashworths are respectable people, and young Simon is their only son. Margaret, at least, has the sense to understand her position." Miss Marple made a small noise that could have indicated agreement or mere acknowledgement. She was watching Margaret Ashworth, who stood near the window with her mother, speaking in low tones, while her mother patted her hand with the sort of comfort one offers to someone who has performed a service, however unpleasant. Something about the scene troubled Miss Marple, though she could not quite articulate precisely what. It was a feeling rather than a fact, the sort of small discordance that occurred when a person's behavior, however well explained, did not quite align with the internal logic of their character. "I wonder," Miss Marple said quietly, "whether we might be hasty in our conclusions. Suicide is a dreadful business, and yet one hesitates to assume the worst without evidence." Mrs. Phillips turned to her with some surprise. "Well, what else can it be?" Eleanor was clearly troubled, and she was found in the orchard near the old wall. Young Thomas mentioned there were scratches on her arms, and her dress was torn. "It seems obvious enough." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "it does seem obvious, and yet, in my experience, the obvious explanation is precisely what a clever person wishes us to believe." She paused, taking a delicate sip of her tea. "Tell me, Mrs. Phillips, did you know Eleanor well, only as well as one knows the schoolteacher's daughter? Quiet girl, kept to herself mostly. "Why do you ask?" "Merely curiosity," Miss Marple said. "I was wondering whether she seemed the sort of person to do something so dramatic. In my long life I've noticed that people rarely act entirely out of character, no matter how much grief they might be suffering." This observation hung in the air between them, troubling in its implications. Mrs. Phillips did not know quite how to respond, so she took refuge in another sip of tea, leaving Miss Marple to her own thoughts. Those thoughts, as it happened, were already turning toward matters that no one else had yet considered. Eleanor's hands, for instance, had been quite clean, no scratches of her own, though her arms bore them, and Margaret's tore. Which she had attributed to her discovery of the body, was remarkably deliberate in its placement. Moreover, Miss Marple had observed Eleanor leaving the village library just 3 weeks prior, carrying a book about inheritance law, a choice that seemed curious for a young woman supposedly so distracted by romantic disappointment. Small details, each insignificant on its own. Together, however, they formed the beginning of a pattern. The county police arrived at 5:30 in the person of Inspector Harold Blackwood, a man of middle years with the bearing of someone who had seen considerably more of the world's darkness than Thornfield had to offer. He was accompanied by a younger sergeant named Collins, whose notebook already bore several hastily scribbled pages of preliminary observations. Together, they established themselves in the village hall with the efficiency of an occupying force, though their manner remained civil enough. The sort of professionalism that comes from long practice at managing communities caught between shock and speculation. Sergeant Hartley, somewhat relieved to have authority transferred to someone more senior, provided a brief account of the morning's events. Eleanor Hartwell had been found by Margaret Ashworth at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, lying near the old stone wall that bordered the eastern edge of the Rowan Orchard. There were signs of struggle. Torn clothing, scratches on her arms and neck, bruising consistent with a fall or violent contact. The exact cause of death would require the services of the medical examiner, but preliminary observations suggested asphyxiation. A silk scarf, later identified as Eleanor's own, had been wound tightly around her neck. "And Miss Ashworth was quite certain of the time?" Inspector Blackwood asked, his eyes moving over the assembled villagers with the systematic assessment. "Of a man cataloguing evidence in human form. She found her whilst making her way back from the livestock exhibition," Hartley explained. "The fair was well underway. Multiple people can confirm she was absent from the main grounds for approximately 30 minutes. And who was she with before she took the shortcut through the orchard?" "She claims to have been alone, sir. The path through the Rowan Orchard is a common route from the northern exhibitions back to the village proper. Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly with her knitting, she had thought it prudent to have brought needlework, as idle hands often attracted unwanted conversation, observed the way Inspector Blackwood's jaw tightened at this information. He was a thorough man, she judged, the sort who did not care for convenient narratives, even when they presented themselves with suitable tragic resolution. This was good. Thornfield would benefit from a thorough man. Inspector Blackwood proceeded to conduct preliminary interviews, beginning with Margaret Ashworth, whose account she provided with admirable composure, all things considered. She had left the livestock exhibition at approximately 2:15. She had walked the shortcut she knew well, having lived in Thornfield her entire life. She had seen no one else on the path. Upon reaching the stone wall, she had noticed something pale among the overgrown vegetation, Eleanor's dress as it transpired. She had approached, thinking perhaps Eleanor had fallen, and had discovered the terrible truth. She had then made her way back to the fair to report what she had found. "And you are quite certain Eleanor was already deceased?" Inspector Blackwood asked gently. "Yes," Margaret replied. "There was no doubt about it. Did you touch the body at all? Move anything, perhaps in alarm?" Margaret's composure wavered very slightly. I may have touched her." "Hold her, just for a moment, to be certain." She paused. The scarf was already around her neck. I could see that immediately. Miss Marple noted the hesitation, the way Margaret's fingers twisted together in her lap before she forced them to stillness. Alarm, certainly, but also something else. the particular anxiety of someone who has been caught in a small untruth and is unsure whether it matters. Whether, in fact, anyone would notice. Inspector Blackwood interviewed David and Catherine Hartwell next, a painful process conducted in an adjoining room, but visible to the waiting villagers through the partially open door. Catherine Hartwell wept quietly, her earlier nervous disposition utterly shattered by the confirmation of her worst fears. David Hartwell sat rigidly, answering questions with the measured precision of a man attempting to maintain control through sheer force of will. He confirmed that Eleanor had seemed distressed in recent weeks, that she had been less communicative, that he and his wife had attributed this to the romantic disappointment regarding Simon Ashworth. "Did you know Eleanor had ended the courtship?" Inspector Blackwood asked. "Margaret Ashworth's mother informed us of it," David replied. "She felt it necessary that we understand Eleanor's unsuitable attachment had been terminated." "How did Eleanor respond to this termination?" "With resignation, we thought. She said it was for the best, that there was no future in it." He paused. "We did not believe she was suicidal, if that is what you are implying." "I am not implying anything, Mr. Hartwell. I am attempting to understand the facts." By 6 o'clock, most of the village had provided preliminary statements. Inspector Blackwood announced that the medical examiner would arrive the following morning, and that until then, the village hall would serve as a temporary headquarters. Anyone with additional information was to report it immediately. The body would be kept in a secure location pending the examination. As the villagers filed out into the autumn evening, Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She was thinking about inheritance law, about the way Eleanor's hand had been positioned when Margaret found her, about the precise angle of that silk scarf. Most of all, she was thinking about the fact that Eleanor Hartwell's mother, Catherine, had worn an expression of shock this afternoon. The shock of genuine surprise, not the shock of confirmed suspicion, which meant that Catherine Hartwell had not known her daughter was going to the Rowan Orchard this afternoon. Which meant, in turn, that Eleanor's presence there had not been a planned escape, but rather something else entirely, something deliberate, something arranged. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again and smiled at nothing in particular. The following morning dawned grey and uncertain, the sort of autumn day that seemed to mirror the village's collective mood. Inspector Blackwood had arranged for a more thorough examination of the Rowan Orchard, and constables from the county force were methodically working through the overgrown pathways, photographing the scene and collecting evidence with the meticulous care of archaeologists excavating history. The medical examiner, a thin, precise man named Dr. Hartson, had arrived at 8 o'clock and spent the better part of 2 hours with Eleanor's body before, delivering his preliminary findings to Inspector Blackwood in the village hall. Miss Marple learned of these findings not through official channels. She was, after all, merely a private citizen, but through the reliable mechanism of Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, who had observed the inspector speaking with Sergeant Hartley near the post office. Mrs. Henderson, being of a naturally observant disposition and possessing no particular commitment to confidentiality, had mentioned these observations to Miss Marple whilst delivering that morning's bread. "Asphyxiation, definitely," Mrs. Henderson whispered, glancing about to ensure no one was within immediate earshot. "That scarf did the job." But here's the curious thing. Dr. Hartson said there were signs of a struggle that had occurred before the asphyxiation. Bruising on her arms, defensive wounds on her hands, as though Eleanor had fought with someone. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, setting aside her toast. "Did he determine approximately how long she had been deceased?" "Between 2 and 3 o'clock, he said." "Sometime during the fair, certainly." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Henderson for this information and settled into thought. The timeline was becoming clearer, though it raised rather more questions than it answered. Eleanor had been killed between 2 and 3 o'clock. Margaret claimed to have found her at 2:30. This meant that either Eleanor had been killed just moments before Margaret discovered her, a striking coincidence, or Margaret's timeline was, shall we say, flexible. More intriguing still was the question of Eleanor's location before her death. The Rowan Orchard was not a place one simply happened to be. One either went there deliberately, or one was taken there. and the presence of defensive wounds suggested that Eleanor had not been a willing participant in whatever had occurred. As Miss Marple pondered these matters, Inspector Blackwood was conducting more formal interviews with the primary suspects, for suspects they had now become. Simon Ashworth was questioned first, a young man of 25 with the anxious expression of someone discovering that life's complications extended beyond his previous experience. He confirmed that he and Eleanor had developed an attachment over the summer, that their courtship had been ended at his mother's insistence, and that he had not seen Eleanor for approximately 6 weeks prior to her death. "Where were you yesterday afternoon, Mr. Ashworth, between 2 and 3 o'clock?" Inspector Blackwood asked. "At the fair, sir. I was helping my father judge the livestock competition. There were dozens of people present. And you did not leave the fair during this time?" "No, sir. I was there the entire afternoon. This could be verified," Inspector Blackwood noted, and moved on to Margaret Ashworth, whose statement differed subtly from what she had provided the previous day. When pressed regarding her exact movements, she admitted that she had spent approximately 10 minutes near the refreshment tent before taking the shortcut through the orchard. She had spoken briefly with Thomas Whitmore about his prize dahlias. She had then proceeded through the orchard and discovered Eleanor's body. "And you touched nothing else?" Inspector Blackwood pressed. "Nothing," Margaret said firmly. "I simply found her and went for help. Yet her fingernails, Miss Marple observed from her position in the hall, bore traces of something dark beneath them. Not quite dirt, more like a stain of some kind. The sort of mark one might acquire if one had grasped something recently and rather urgently." By midday, Inspector Blackwood had also interviewed Thomas Whitmore, whose account of his conversation with Margaret was confirming but vague. He could not remember the exact time of their conversation, only that it had been sometime during the afternoon. He had then returned to the exhibition area to collect his prize ribbon. He had not seen Eleanor Hartwell for several weeks. It was during the afternoon, as Miss Marple was taking her constitutional walk through the village, that she observed something particularly illuminating. She had passed by the schoolhouse, where Catherine Hartwell was hanging washing in the modest garden behind the building. The older woman moved with the mechanical precision of someone performing tasks whilst in profound emotional shock. But what caught Miss Marple's attention was the washing itself, in particular a dress, pale green in colour, that Catherine was hanging with considerable care. Miss Marple paused, ostensibly to admire a late-blooming rose, and observed the dress more carefully. It bore fresh stains, the sort that suggested it had been recently and rather vigorously cleaned. Catherine noticed her lingering gaze and flushed slightly. "Eleanor's dress," she said quietly. "I thought I should clean it before." She did not finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said gently. "Though I wonder, Mrs. Hartwell, whether the police might wish to examine it first. Just for completeness, you understand." Catherine's face went quite pale. I merely wanted to preserve something of her." "A keepsake." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "A natural impulse. Tell me, has Eleanor had any visitors recently? Anyone who might have called upon her?" "Not that I'm aware of," Catherine said, turning back to her washing. She kept very much to herself lately. Yet as Miss Marple walked away, she found herself wondering whether this was quite true, because the dress that Catherine was hanging with such care was not the dress Eleanor had been wearing when she died. The dress Eleanor had worn to her death was pale blue, not pale green, and the green dress bore stains that suggested violence, struggle, and blood. Someone in the Hartwell household, it seemed, had been involved in Eleanor's death. The question now was precisely who, and why. Miss Marple did not immediately report her observation to Inspector Blackwood. This was N.O.T. from any reluctance to assist the investigation, but rather from a principle she had cultivated over many years. Premature revelation of suspicion often causes more harm than good. Instead, she spent the remainder of the afternoon in quiet contemplation, seated in her cottage with a cup of tea and her knitting, allowing the threads of the case to weave themselves into coherent patterns in her mind. The green dress was significant, certainly, but it raised as many questions as it answered. If Catherine Hartwell had been involved in Eleanor's death, why would she have preserved the dress at all? Why not dispose of it entirely, as anyone with even moderate intelligence might have done? The answer, Miss Marple reflected, lay in human nature itself. Catherine had been attempting to protect something, or someone. The dress had been cleaned not to conceal evidence of guilt, but to preserve a daughter's dignity, or perhaps to shield a family member from suspicion. By early evening, Inspector Blackwood had made his first arrest. The news spread through Thornfield with the efficiency of wildfire. David Hartwell had been taken into custody on suspicion of murder. The evidence, as Inspector Blackwood would later explain to those permitted to know such things, was circumstantial but suggestive. David's shoes bore traces of soil consistent with the Rowan Orchard. He had no witness to his whereabouts between 2 and 3 o'clock. He had claimed to be in his study at home, preparing lessons, but no one could corroborate this. Most damning of all, a letter had been discovered in Eleanor's room, written in what appeared to be David's hand, discussing Eleanor's inheritance of her grandmother's estate and the complications this might present to the family's financial situation. "It appears," Inspector Blackwood announced to the assembled villagers that evening, "that Mr. Hartwell may have harbored concerns about Eleanor's inheritance and her planned actions regarding it. It is possible that a confrontation occurred, that matters escalated beyond his control." The village received this news with the particular mixture of satisfaction and unease that comes from having the mystery solved, if somewhat unsatisfactorily. David Hartwell, the respectable schoolteacher, the man who had lived in Thornfield for 20 years, arrested for murdering his own daughter. It was tragic, certainly, but also conclusive. The case seemed closed. Miss Marple, however, found herself profoundly unconvinced. She spent that evening considering the matter from every possible angle, and the more she considered it, the more problematic it became. David Hartwell was many things: anxious, perhaps overly concerned with propriety, certainly capable of worry about financial matters, but he was not a man capable of killing his own daughter with a silk scarf. This was not a conclusion based on sentiment, but on observation. Miss Marple had known many murderers in her time, not personally acquainted with them, of course, but through the unfortunate incidents that seemed to gravitate toward her vicinity. She understood the particular psychology required for such an act, and it simply did not align with what she knew of David Hartwell's character. What did align, however, was Eleanor's behavior regarding her inheritance. The book on inheritance law that Miss Marple had observed Eleanor carrying suggested a young woman taking active steps to understand her financial situation. Combined with the mention of the grandmother's estate in David's letter, a picture began to emerge. Eleanor had come into money, or was about to. She had been planning something with that money, something that would have required her to leave Thornfield, perhaps, or to act in a way her family found objectionable. The next morning, Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Inspector Blackwood. She was received in the parlor of the village hall, where the inspector was reviewing documents with considerable concentration. He looked up at her entrance with an expression of polite tolerance, the sort afforded to elderly ladies who often possessed information of dubious reliability. "I hope I am not interrupting, Inspector," Miss Marple began, settling herself into a chair with the careful precision of advanced age. "I merely wish to share some observations that may be relevant to your investigation." "Of course, Miss Marple. What is it?" "I am wondering," she said thoughtfully, "whether you have had the opportunity to examine Eleanor Hartwell's correspondence carefully, particularly any letters regarding her inheritance." "We have reviewed what we found in her room," Inspector Blackwood replied carefully. "Why do you ask?" "It occurs to me that a young woman who has recently come into financial independence might present a threat to those around her. Not necessarily through any action of her own, but simply through the existence of that independence. People behave differently. When money is involved, Inspector, they see possibilities where none existed before." "You are suggesting that someone killed Eleanor for her money?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that Eleanor's death occurred in a manner far too violent for a simple inheritance dispute. The person who killed Eleanor did so in anger, in the heat of the moment. which means Eleanor must have done something, said something that provoked that anger, something that could not be anticipated or prevented. Inspector Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying this small, elderly woman with renewed interest. "Do you have a theory, Miss Marple?" "I have several theories," she admitted, "but I believe the most lie. Kelly's explanation requires us to examine not Eleanor's plans, but her actions of the previous day. I wonder, Inspector, whether you have interviewed everyone who was present at the fair yesterday. Everyone, that is, who might have been in the Rowan Orchard between 2 and 3 o'clock. What are you implying? Merely that murder, Inspector, is rarely committed by those who appear most obviously guilty, and David Hartwell, despite his letters and his financial concerns, does not appear to me to be a man capable of strangling his own daughter." Inspector Blackwood's expression shifted, a subtle acknowledgement that Miss Marple had said something worth considering. He set down his pen and folded his hands. "Tell me, Miss Marple, what you believe actually happened in the Rowan Orchard yesterday afternoon." Miss Marple took a moment to arrange her thoughts, aware that she was about to construct a narrative that would require considerable justification. Inspector Blackwood waited with the patience of a man who had learned that silence often encouraged fuller disclosure than premature questioning. "I believe," Miss Marple began, "that Eleanor did not go to the Rowan Orchard of her own volition. Someone arranged to meet her there, someone whose presence would not have aroused suspicion or whose absence from the fair would have gone unnoticed. This person met Eleanor with the intention of discussing something of considerable importance. We might speculate about what that conversation concerned, her inheritance perhaps, or her intentions regarding Simon Ashworth, or something else entirely. But during this conversation, something occurred that caused one of them to act in violence. And you believe this person to be someone other than David Hartwell?" "I am quite certain of it," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Hartwell is a man of deliberation and caution. If he had wished to prevent Eleanor from inheriting or from doing something with her inheritance, he would have done so through conversation, through manipulation of family dynamics, through the exercise of paternal authority. He would not have arranged a clandestine meeting in the orchard. More importantly, he would not have done so during the fair, when his absence from home might be noticed, when witnesses might see him on the path. Then who, in your estimation, did arrange this meeting?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "I believe it was someone Eleanor trusted, someone whose company would have seemed natural and unremarkable, someone, moreover, who had a compelling reason to prevent Eleanor from acting on her newfound independence." Inspector Blackwood rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the grey morning. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man reconsidering certainties he had begun to embrace. "Miss Marple, are you aware that Margaret Ashworth has recently become engaged?" This was news to Miss Marple, though upon reflection, it was not surprising news. She indicated her continued attention with a small tilt of her head. "She became engaged 3 weeks ago," Inspector Blackwood continued, "to a gentleman from the neighboring county. A substantial match, according to the reports. The wedding is planned for spring. It would be a significant step up in her circumstances, considerably more so than would have been possible had Eleanor remained alive and in possession of her inheritance." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And was this engagement known to Eleanor?" "According to Margaret, mother, yes. Eleanor congratulated her publicly." "Did she indeed?" Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as a bird's, fixed upon the inspector. "Inspector, I wonder whether you have had the opportunity to examine the scratches on Eleanor's arms more carefully. Specifically, I wondered whether Dr. Hartson was able to determine the nature of the object that caused them." Inspector Blackwood returned to his desk and retrieved a folder containing the medical examiner's report. He scanned it briefly before responding. "The scratches appear to have been caused by fingernails, human fingernails, according to Dr. Hartson's assessment. The evidence suggests that Eleanor was attacked by another person who she attempted to resist. And were any scratches found on the hands of the person you have arrested?" Inspector Blackwood consulted the report again, his expression growing darker. "No. David Hartwell has no marks of any kind on his hands or arms." "Which would seem to suggest," Miss Marple said gently, that David Hartwell may not be responsible for the scratches inflicted upon Eleanor's body during her struggle. A curious oversight in the evidence against him, would you not say? The inspector closed the folder with careful deliberation. You believe Margaret Ashworth killed Eleanor? I believe, Miss Marple corrected, that Margaret Ashworth met Eleanor in the Rowan Orchard yesterday afternoon. I believe they had an argument, quite possibly regarding the inheritance, or regarding what Eleanor's newfound independence might mean for the village's social arrangements. I believe this argument became heated, and at some point, Margaret produced the scarf, Eleanor's own scarf, which she would have known Eleanor carried, having lived in the same village all her life. I believe that in a moment of panic or rage or desperation, Margaret used that scarf to silence Eleanor's objections to whatever it was Margaret wanted. That is a serious accusation, Inspector Blackwood said quietly. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. It is, but consider the physical evidence. Margaret has scratches on her hands. I observed them yesterday, beneath her fingernails. She has dirt bene. Those nails consistent with the Rowan Orchard. Her dress was torn, but not by Eleanor in struggle, torn by Margaret herself to create the appearance of shock and trauma at her discovery. Her timeline was deliberately vague, allowing her time to commit the murder and then return to the fair before discovering the body. But why? Inspector Blackwood pressed. Why would Margaret kill Eleanor over an inheritance dispute? They were not in competition for anything, were they not? Miss Marple asked. Consider what Eleanor's inheritance represented. It represented freedom. It represented the possibility that Eleanor might choose to leave Thornfield to pursue a life beyond the village's expectations. More importantly, it represented a challenge to the social order that Margaret and her family had always taken for granted. Eleanor, the schoolteacher's daughter, would suddenly possess more money than Margaret's fiancé's family expected. This would have required renegotiation of Eleanor's place in the social hierarchy. Inspector Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. And you believe this was sufficient motive for murder? No, Miss Marple said. I believe there was another motive entirely. A motive so personal, so immediate, that it precipitated violence in a moment of passion. But I cannot determine what that motive was without further investigation. What I can tell you is that David Hartwell is innocent, and that the guilty party is someone far closer to Eleanor than he. The inspector stood abruptly. I shall require a warrant to search Margaret Ashworth's room and possessions, and I shall need to speak with her again, regarding those scratches. Yes, Miss Marple said, I believe you will find the evidence you require. The search of Margaret Ashworth's room took place that afternoon, conducted with the formal precision of an official investigation. Inspector Blackwood and Sergeant Collins arrived at the Ashworth residence with a warrant, while Miss Marple remained in the village hall, occupied with her knitting and her observations of the village's reaction to this new development. Word had spread with remarkable speed. David Hartwell's innocence was becoming apparent to all, though the full implications of Margaret's involvement had not yet crystallized in the public consciousness. It was Thomas Whitmore who brought the news to Miss Marple, his young face troubled with conflicting emotions. He had been at the Ashworth house, he explained, helping with some repairs, when the police arrived. He had seen them emerge from Margaret's room carrying a small wooden box, and he had distinctly heard Inspector Blackwood speak to Margaret about scratches and forensic evidence. It cannot be true, Thomas said, his voice carrying the desperate certainty of youth confronted with betrayal. Margaret would never. She was fond of Eleanor. Everyone knew that. Were they fond of each other? Miss Marple asked gently, or was there perhaps something more complicated between them? Thomas hesitated, and in that hesitation Miss Marple understood that there was indeed something more. She waited, allowing silence to work its particular magic on the young man's conscience. They argued, Thomas finally admitted. I heard them about 3 weeks ago. I was passing through the Ashworth garden when I heard raised voices from inside the house. Margaret was saying something about promises, about how Eleanor had no right to change things. Eleanor was saying that it was her money, her decision, and Margaret couldn't stop her. How very enlightening, Miss Marple murmured. Did you hear what Eleanor intended to do with this money? Something about leaving Thornfield. about not accepting the engagement her parents had apparently arranged for her. Enor said she was going to use the inheritance to go to London, to study medicine or some such thing. Margaret said she couldn't possibly abandon her family and her duties. Thomas paused. But that was 3 weeks ago. They seemed to have resolved it by the time of the fair, which suggested, Miss Marple reflected, that the matter had not been resolved at all, but merely postponed. Eleanor had gone to the Rowan Orchard yesterday afternoon, having made a final decision regarding her future. And Margaret, perhaps hoping for one last opportunity to change her mind, had arranged to meet her there. By evening, Inspector Blackwood had assembled sufficient evidence to warrant a more formal interrogation. Margaret Ashworth was brought to the village hall, no longer as a helpful witness, but as a suspect in custody. Miss Marple observed the girl's arrival from her position near the window, the way Margaret's composure had fractured, the way her hands trembled as she was escorted inside, the desperate glance she cast toward her mother, who followed at a distance with an expression of anguished incomprehension. Inspector Blackwood requested Miss Marple's presence during the interrogation, a recognition of her invaluable insights. She was positioned in a corner of the room, ostensibly merely observing, though her presence itself seemed to unsettle Margaret considerably. "The scratches on your hands, Miss Ashworth," Inspector Blackwood began, his voice carefully neutral. "How did you acquire them?" "From the brambles in the orchard," Margaret replied, her voice steady enough. "When I discovered Eleanor's body, I reached out to try to help her. The vegetation near the wall is quite overgrown. The medical examiner is of the opinion that these scratches were inflicted by human fingernails, not vegetation. Moreover, analysis of the material beneath your fingernails is consistent with human tissue, not plant matter." Margaret's face went pale. I may have caught myself when I was startled. When I saw Eleanor." "Is it possible," Inspector Blackwood continued, "that the scratches were inflicted earlier than you have claimed? During an altercation with Eleanor herself?" "No, I would never." "The wooden box found in your room contains a series of letters," the inspector interrupted. "Letters from Eleanor written over the past several weeks. In them, Eleanor discusses her plans to use her inheritance to leave Thornfield. She mentions your opposition to these plans. Most importantly, she discusses a final conversation she intended to have with you yesterday afternoon in the Rowan Orchard. A conversation, she wrote, where she intended to make clear that her mind was absolutely made up." Margaret's composure crumbled entirely. Tears began to stream down her face, though whether from genuine remorse or from the shock of discovery, it was difficult to determine. "She was going to leave," Margaret whispered. "She was going to abandon everything, her family, her responsibilities, her place in society. She was going to run off to London like some sort of common adventuress. I couldn't allow it." "And so you met her in the orchard," Inspector Blackwood said quietly. "You attempted to convince her to change her mind. When she refused, what happened?" "She said such terrible things," Margaret continued, her voice now that of someone confessing rather than defending. "She said I was jealous, that I was trying to control her because I was afraid of being left behind. She said my engagement was meaningless, that I was settling for respectability when I could have had something more. She said I was weak." The room fell silent except for Margaret's ragged breathing. Miss Marple, watching from her corner, saw the moment when the full weight of what Margaret had done settled upon her consciousness. "I didn't mean to kill her," Margaret said, her voice broken. "I brought the scarf, her own scarf, thinking I might. I don't know what I was thinking. We struggled. She was so much stronger than I expected, so determined. And then the scarf was around her neck and I was pulling, and she couldn't breathe and I couldn't stop, and she could not continue." Inspector Blackwood signaled Sergeant Collins, who led the girl away, her confession hanging in the air like a stain that would not wash clean. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her expression unchanged. She had known, of course, that this would be the outcome. The tragedy of it all was not in the mystery's solution, but in the fact that it had been so entirely preventable had anyone possessed the wisdom to see what Eleanor needed far more than respectability, the freedom to become herself. The confession of Margaret Ashworth spread through Thornfield with the particular velocity that comes from a truth more shocking than any fabrication could have been. By the following morning, the narrative had shifted entirely. David Hartwell, the innocent man who had spent a night in custody on suspicion of murdering his own daughter, was formally released with the inspector's sincere apologies. Margaret Ashworth, the respectable doctor's daughter, with the advantageous engagement, was remanded in custody pending trial for murder. The village found itself occupying that strange space between relief and profound discomfort. The mystery had been solved, certainly, but the solution offered no comfort whatsoever. It was far easier to imagine a father driven to desperate measures by financial anxiety than to contemplate a young woman of good family, good breeding, and good prospects murdering her childhood companion in a moment of thwarted control. Miss Marple spent the morning of Margaret's confession in quiet reflection, though not, as some might have assumed, regarding the dramatic revelation itself. Rather, she was contemplating those aspects of the case that remained unresolved, those loose threads that continued to trouble her orderly mind despite the apparent conclusion of the investigation. It was mid-morning when Catherine Hartwell called upon her. The schoolteacher's wife appeared diminished by grief, yet there was something else in her expression. A need, perhaps, to understand how her daughter's death had come about, and what role, if any, she herself might have played in precipitating it. "I have been thinking," Catherine said, accepting the cup of tea Miss Marple offered with an expression of gratitude that seemed disproportionate to the gesture, "about Eleanor's inheritance. I did not know the extent of it until after her death. Eleanor kept her affairs quite private. But the solicitor's letter made clear that her grandmother's estate was substantial, nearly £8,000, a considerable sum for a young woman with no dependents. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, that would indeed provide Eleanor with genuine independence, the sort of independence that would have allowed her to pursue an education, or to establish herself elsewhere, or to make choices that were entirely her own. We would have managed. "Kit," Catherine said quietly, "David and I. If Eleanor had simply spoken to us, if she had explained what she wanted, we might have understood. We might have helped her. Would you have?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Or would you, like Margaret, have attempted to convince her that her duty lay elsewhere? That the proper course was marriage, respectability, the continuation of established patterns?" Catherine did not answer immediately. She turned her teacup in her hands, watching the cooling liquid as though it might reveal truths she was too afraid to voice aloud. "I think," she finally said, "that we would have tried. Not because we are cruel people, but because we are frightened people. Eleanor was always different, you see. Even as a child, she asked questions that made us uncomfortable. She wanted to know why women could not study law, why girls were educated only in accomplishments rather than in subjects of substance. We loved her for her intelligence, but we also found it troubling. It suggested possibilities we did not know how to manage." "And Margaret," Miss Marple prompted. "What of her?" "Margaret and Eleanor were friends since childhood. More than friends, really. Sisters in spirit, if not in blood. But as they grew older, their paths diverged. Margaret became increasingly concerned with the social requirements that would secure her position. She began to view Eleanor's ambitions not as inspirational, but as threatening, as though Eleanor's determination to escape the village's expectations somehow reflected poorly on Margaret's choice to embrace them." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It is a common enough pattern in human relationships. One person's freedom appears to another as an implicit criticism of their own choices. The more Eleanor insisted on her right to pursue her own path, the more Margaret felt compelled to defend the path she had chosen. Until finally, in a moment of absolute confrontation, that defensiveness transformed into something far more sinister. "Do you believe Eleanor knew what she was provoking?" Catherine asked. "Do you think she understood how angry Margaret had become?" "I believe Eleanor understood very well," Miss Marple said. "And I believe she went to that meeting in the orchard hoping to resolve the matter once and for all, to make Margaret understand that her choice of independence was not a judgment on Margaret's choice of conformity. But Eleanor was young. and youth often lacks the tact required to navigate such delicate emotional terrain. She spoke with the absolute certainty of someone who has just discovered her own power, and that certainty, unfortunately, can be deeply wounding to those who feel their own power slipping away. Catherine set down her teacup with trembling hands. "I have been thinking about what Eleanor might have become, a doctor, perhaps, or a scholar. She was clever enough for either, and now, because of one moment of violence, because of one person's inability to accept that the world was changing, all of that potential is simply gone." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "that is perhaps the greatest tragedy of all. Not the death itself, though that is terrible enough, but the loss of what Eleanor might have contributed to the world, the lives she might have touched, the knowledge she might have gained, the example she might have set for other young women. All of it, extinguished by someone's fear of change." They sat in companionable silence for a time, two women separated by decades but united in their understanding of human nature's infinite capacity for both beauty and tragedy. "I am glad," Catherine finally said, "that you were here, that you saw what others could not see. At least Eleanor's death will not be forgotten as suicide, as weakness. At East, the truth of what happened has come to light. The truth," Miss Marple mused, "is often a complicated thing. But yes, in this case, I believe the truth, however painful, is far preferable to the lie that was beginning to take root. Eleanor deserves that much, at the very least." After Catherine departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking with their familiar, soothing rhythm. But her mind was already turning toward other matters, other observations about the nature of the village and its inhabitants, that would likely prove significant in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. Inspector Blackwood departed Thornfield on the morning of the third day following Eleanor's death. His investigation concluded, and his evidence secured for the forthcoming trial. He left behind a village fundamentally altered by the revelation that violence and murder could emerge from the most respectable sources, that the carefully maintained facade of social propriety could conceal passions as destructive as those found in any criminal underworld. Before his departure, however, he requested one final meeting with Miss Marple, conducted in the privacy of the vicar's study. "I have been reflecting on your insights throughout this investigation," Inspector Blackwood began, settling into a chair with the manner of a man who had learned to value unconventional perspectives. "There are aspects of the case that my official reports do not address, matters that fall outside the scope of police procedure, but which seem to me to demand some form of acknowledgement." "What aspects concern you, Inspector?" Miss Marple inquired. "The question of complicity," he said bluntly. "Margaret Ashworth did not act in a vacuum. She was encouraged, perhaps not consciously, but encouraged nonetheless by the attitudes of those around her, by her parents' concern with social standing by Sim, on Ashworth's family's dismissal of Eleanor as unsuitable, by the village's collective assumption that a young woman of Eleanor's class and situation should accept the role assigned to her without question. In a sense, we all conspired in Eleanor's death, an uncomfortable truth, Miss Marple acknowledged. But I would hesitate to assign blame quite so broadly. Yes, the village's attitudes toward women and their proper place certainly contributed to the circumstances that led to the tragedy. But Margaret Ashworth made a choice, a terrible choice, made in a moment of passion and fear, but a choice nonetheless. The village did not force her hand around that scarf. Her own will, her own desperate need to maintain control did that. Inspector Blackwood was quiet for a moment. "Do you believe Margaret will hang?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that the courts will make their judgment based on the evidence and the law as they understand it. I believe that Margaret will likely be convicted, given her confession. Whether she will hang or receive a lesser sentence depends on factors beyond my knowledge or influence. What I do believe is that Margaret will spend the remainder of her life understanding precisely what her moment of violence cost the world. That seems a fitting punishment," the inspector said, "though perhaps a crueler one than any court could impose." After he departed, Miss Marple found herself walking through the village with no particular destination in mind, her feet carrying her along familiar paths, while her mind occupied itself with larger considerations. She passed the Ashworth residence, where the windows appeared shuttered, as though the house itself was mourning. She passed the school, where a substitute teacher was now conducting Eleanor's classes, carrying on the work that Eleanor would never complete. She passed the Rowan Orchard itself, where nothing now marked the location of the tragedy, except the particular absence of people who might have once walked those paths. It was Thomas Whitmore she encountered near the village green, his young face bearing the marks of sleepless nights and troubled contemplation. He had been standing motionless for some time, staring at nothing in particular, before he noticed Miss Marple's approach. "She asked me to go with her," he said without preamble. Eleanor did. "2 weeks ago she asked if I would consider leaving Thornfield, going to London with her. She said I was clever enough to learn a trade, that we could make a life together outside the village's constraints. And what did you answer?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I told her I couldn't leave my family, that I had responsibilities here, that it was impossible." He paused, his voice cracking slightly. "I told her she was being foolish to imagine such things. And she accepted my refusal without argument, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. If I had said yes, Eleanor would still be alive. We would have left Thornfield together, and Margaret would never have had the opportunity to—" "My dear boy," Miss Marple interrupted, "you cannot hold yourself responsible for Eleanor's death. You made a choice based on your own circumstances and limitations. That choice was not wrong simply because it was different from the choice Eleanor would have made. Eleanor needed to leave Thornfield, but that did not mean everyone needed to leave. There is room in the world for those who choose to stay as well as those who choose to go. But if I had been braver, then you would have been a different person," Miss Marple said, "and Eleanor might have been different as well. We cannot remake ourselves to suit the demands of others' dreams, Thomas, no matter how much we might wish to do so." Thomas was silent for a long time. Finally, he asked, "Do you think Eleanor was happy? At any point, before she died?" Miss Marple considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "I believe Eleanor experienced moments of happiness, yes, but more importantly, I believe she experienced hope. She believed that her future held possibilities beyond what Thornfield could offer. That belief sustained her, even though it ultimately cost her her life. In a sense, Eleanor won her freedom, not in the way she had hoped, but she is no longer bound by the village's expectations or constraints. That seems a poor consolation," Thomas said bitterly. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "it is. But it is the only consolation available to us now. We cannot change what has happened. We can only choose, going forward, to live in a way that honors what Eleanor was striving toward. That, I think, would be the greatest tribute we could offer her memory." As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, she found herself thinking about the nature of legacy in memory, about how the dead continue to shape the living through the absence they leave behind. Eleanor Hartwell would be remembered, not as a medical student or scholar, but as a murder victim and a catalyst for murder. Yet perhaps, in her way, she would still change Thornfield, not through her presence, but through the uncomfortable questions her death had forced the village to confront. 3 weeks had passed since Eleanor Hartwell's death, and Thornfield had begun the delicate process of attempting to return to normalcy, or at least to whatever approximation of normalcy a village could achieve after such a profound disruption. The trees had turned from gold to crimson, and the autumn air carried the particular scent of endings and preparations for winter. Life, as it always does, continued its relentless forward motion, regardless of the tragedy that had occurred within its midst. Miss Marple had received a letter from Inspector Blackwood, informing her that the Crown Prosecution Service had decided to proceed with charges against Margaret Ashworth for murder. The trial would take place in the spring, at the county assizes. Margaret remained in custody, her engagement dissolved, her family in a state of profound social disgrace. The Ashworths had begun quiet discussions about relocating, though such matters moved slowly in a village where reputation was the currency of existence. It was a Tuesday afternoon when David Hartwell appeared at Miss Marple's cottage, his manner bearing the formal courtesy of a man who had survived something terrible and was still learning how to exist in its aftermath. She received him in her sitting room, offering tea and biscuits with her usual calm hospitality, as though this were a social call of the most ordinary kind, rather than a meeting between the father of a murdered girl and the woman who had instrumental in identifying her killer. "I wanted to thank you," David began, his voice bearing the careful control of someone who had practiced this conversation many times before delivering it, "for seeing what others could not see, for recognizing that I could not have done this thing. I merely observed what was present to be observed," Miss Marple replied. The scratches on Margaret's hands, the inconsistency in her timeline, the letters Eleanor had written to her. These things existed whether I acknowledged them or not. Inspector Blackwood would eventually have noticed them himself. "Perhaps," David said, though his tone suggested he did not entirely believe this. "But you noticed them quickly enough to prevent me from being convicted of a crime I did not commit. For that, I am profoundly grateful." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken things hanging between them. Innerly, David continued, his voice becoming quieter, more introspective. "Catherine has been reading Eleanor's letters, the ones that Margaret kept, that Inspector Blackwood returned to us. Eleanor wrote about her plans, about the life she wanted to build. She wrote about feeling trapped by the village's expectations, by our expectations, and I find myself wondering," he paused, struggling with the words, "I find myself wondering whether we might have handled things differently, whether we might have been the sort of parents who could have supported Eleanor's ambitions rather than attempting to constrain them. That," Miss Marple said gently, "is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. What I can tell you is that Eleanor loved you and her mother very much. She did not leave because she hated you, but because she needed to become herself, and she understood that the village, and yes, perhaps your own fears and limitations, would have prevented that. She was not rejecting you so much as she was reaching for something beyond what you could provide. But she would still be alive if she had stayed," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "She would still be alive if she had accepted the life we wanted for her." "Yes," Miss Marple acknowledged. "That is quite possibly true. But Eleanor would also have spent the rest of her life wondering about the paths she did not take, resenting the life she was forced to accept. There is a particular kind of death that occurs when a person spends their entire existence constrained by circumstances they did not choose and cannot change. Eleanor chose, instead, to risk everything for the possibility of authentic life. That was a courageous choice, even though it ultimately cost her everything." David left shortly thereafter, carrying with him Miss Marple's words like a burden he was not yet ready to fully accept. But she said that, over time, as grief transformed from the acute sting of fresh loss into the dull ache of acceptance, David would come to understand that his daughter's death, while tragic and preventable, was ultimately an expression of her own agency and determination. In some twisted way, Eleanor had won her independence, not in the form she had sought, but won nonetheless. The following Sunday, Miss Marple attended the Harvest Thanksgiving service at St. Mary's Church, as she did every year. The vicar's sermon was, as might be expected, carefully constructed to acknowledge the tragedy that had befallen the village while redirecting attention toward themes of divine mercy and human redemption. The congregation listened with varying degrees of attention, their thoughts clearly occupied with the ongoing scandal that continued to dominate village conversation despite efforts to move forward. After the service, as Miss Marple stood outside the church exchanging pleasantries with the other parishioners, she observed something that would have escaped the notice of virtually everyone else. Simon Ashworth, Eleanor's former attachment, stood somewhat apart from the main group, his expression bearing the particular sadness of someone who had been forced to confront the consequences of his own choices and inaction. He had not been in love with Eleanor, Miss Marple suspected, not in any profound sense. But he had cared for her, and his failure to support her ambitions, his willingness to allow his family's prejudices to determine the course of their relationship, had contributed to the desperation that had ultimately led to her death. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, The needles clicked in their familiar rhythm as she worked at a new project, a shawl in autumn colors that seemed to match her mood perfectly. She was thinking about Eleanor, about the brief, bright flame of ambition and hope that had burned so fiercely before being extinguished. She was thinking about Margaret, sitting in her cell, slowly coming to understand the true cost of her moment of violence. She was thinking about all the small choices that had accumulated to create the conditions for tragedy. And she was thinking, as she always did after resolving a case, about the nature of human nature itself, about the desperate ways in which people attempted to control and manipulate those around them, and about how often those desperate attempts ended in catastrophe. The world, Miss Marple reflected, was a complicated place, far more complicated than most people wished to acknowledge. Winter came to Thornfield with surprising gentleness that year, the snow falling in soft, deliberate flakes that seemed almost apologetic in their arrival. By December, the village had begun to settle into the routines that winter demanded: shorter days, longer nights, the gathering together of those seeking warmth and companionship against the cold. The scandal of Eleanor Hartwell's death had not faded entirely, but it had taken on the quality of established history rather than immediate shock. People spoke of it now with the careful tone one uses when discussing events that have been thoroughly processed and filed away in the village's collective memory. Miss Marple was preparing her Christmas parcels when the final piece of the puzzle presented itself, though not in the form she might have anticipated. It came via a letter, delivered by the afternoon post, bearing a London postmark and the careful handwriting of someone for whom letter writing was clearly a considered undertaking. The envelope was addressed simply to Miss Marple, St. Mary Mead, a testament to the fact that Miss Marple's reputation had begun to extend beyond the bounder. Rise of her own village. The letter was from Dr. Catherine Wells, headmistress of a London teaching hospital that trained young women in medical practice. She wrote to express her profound regret at learning of Eleanor Hartwell's death, for Eleanor had, it appeared, written to this institution some months prior, inquiring about the requirements for study. Eleanor had been, the letter suggested, precisely the sort of student the hospital sought: intelligent, determined, willing to challenge conventional assumptions about what women were capable of achieving. It is a particular tragedy, Dr. Wells wrote, that Miss Hartwell was prevented from pursuing her ambitions by forces beyond her control. I wished you to know that her death was not without meaning. It has prompted considerable reflection within our institution regarding the barriers that discourage young women of talent from pursuing professional advancement. We are, as a direct result of contemplating Miss Hartwell's fate, implementing new scholarship programs specifically designed to support students from smaller villages and less advantaged circumstances. In this way, Eleanor's tragic death will contribute, however indirectly, to the advancement of other young women who might otherwise have faced similar constraints. Miss Marple read this letter several times, her expression thoughtful. She then folded it carefully and placed it in a small wooden box where she kept other significant documents, items that had proved meaningful to her over the years. It seemed to her that Dr. Wells had understood something essential about Eleanor's death, that while it could not be undone, and while its tragedy could not be diminished, it could perhaps be transformed into something that served a purpose beyond mere mourning. On Christmas Eve, the village gathered for the traditional carol service. The church was decorated with holly and ivy, with candles burning in every available space, casting warm light against the December darkness. The congregation sang the familiar hymns, their voices blending in that particular harmony that only comes from generations of people singing the same words in the same place. Miss Marple stood with the others, her voice thin but steady, her mind occupied with the events of the past 3 months and the ways they had altered Thornfield's understanding of itself. After the service concluded, she lingered in the church while others filed out into the cold night. She found herself standing before the memorial board that listed the names of parishioners who had passed away in service to the parish, soldiers from the Great War primarily, along with a few others who had made particular contributions to village life. Eleanor Hartwell's name did not appear there, and Miss Marple found herself reflecting on this absence. Eleanor would eventually receive a memorial of some kind, she imagined, though perhaps not in the form she might have chosen for herself. Walking home through the snowy streets, Miss Marple encountered Thomas Whitmore, who was delivering last-minute Christmas parcels for the village post office. He had aged considerably, she thought, in the 3 months since Eleanor's death. The lightness of youth had been replaced by something more considered, more grave. "I have decided to leave Thornfield," he said without preamble, as though he had been waiting for the opportunity to tell Miss Marple this news. "I have secured an apprenticeship with a carpenter in the neighboring county. I will be leaving after New Year." "That is excellent news," Miss Marple said warmly. "Eleanor would have been pleased." "I thought of her," Thomas admitted, "and I realized that she was right. There are possibilities beyond what Thornfield offers. It took her death to make me understand that, which seems a terrible thing to say, but it is true. I intend to honor that understanding by pursuing my own ambitions, by not allowing fear to dictate the course of my life as it did before." As Miss Marple continued her walk, she found herself contemplating the unexpected ways in which tragedy radiates outward through communities. Eleanor's death had been a catalyst, not merely for the exposure of Margaret's crime, but for genuine change. David Hartwell had begun a private correspondence with educators interested in reforming the school curriculum to include more rigorous academic subjects for female students. Catherine Hartwell had taken on volunteer work with a charitable organization dedicated to assisting young women seeking education. Thomas Whitmore was pursuing ambitions he had previously abandoned. And somewhere in London, Dr. Catherine Wells was implementing programs that would transform the lives of countless young women Eleanor would never meet. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her chair and resumed her knitting. The shawl was nearly complete now, its autumn colors blending together in patterns of remarkable beauty. She thought about Eleanor, about the extraordinary ordinariness of her death. Not a grand tragedy, but a small, preventable catastrophe that had occurred in a small village because people were afraid of change and could not accept what they could not control. But she also thought about legacy, about the ways that lives continue to ripple outward even after death, about how Eleanor's brief 30 years had set in motion events that would ultimately benefit people she would never know. It was not the life Eleanor had envisioned for herself, but it was, in its way, a kind of immortality. The village of Thornfield would never be quite the same again. The autumn fair would continue, the gardens would bloom, the children would attend school and grow into adults, and eventually into the elders who guided the village's traditions. But underlying all of this, there would persist the memory of Eleanor Hartwell, not as a victim, but as a spark that had illuminated truths about the world and about human nature that Thornfield had preferred not to acknowledge. And in London, and in neighboring counties, and in places yet unknown, young women would be given opportunities because of Eleanor's courageous insistence that a different life was possible. That, Miss Marple reflected, was perhaps the most fitting memorial of all.